Shalom and welcome to another Petakamol podcast from Bay Abidan, teaching Noahide Judaism for Messianic Hebrews. It is Friday, the 31st of January, 2025, and I have in the studio with me JC. JC is a new friend. We've been chatting a couple of times over sort of coffee mornings and some telephone conversations the past couple of weeks. And he's very good at keeping me on track with regards to describing the origins of Islam. So we thought it would be a good idea to just record our chats for the benefit of anybody else who wants to listen in to our conversations. And as he sort of picks my brains to try and help describe the origins of Islam in a clear and succinct sort of way. Okay, so JC, do you want to do any kind of introduction for yourself? You can put this on your channel later. JC also has his own channel. I'll put a link to his channel below so you can subscribe afterwards. So JC, as you like, just introduce yourself as much as you want to.
Well, rather than having like a full introduction, is what you have said before. I am just another guy who is actually trying to figure out what happened with Islam and how it all began, because everything seems to be very, very messy, particularly once you start reading their actual traditions. You see lots of things that don't really make sense, they don't fit, and we are trying to put all of those pieces together. And everybody has like different pieces of this really huge jigsaw puzzle, and I'm trying to actually speak with people who have access to different source data, and they can actually paint a better picture of what actually happened. And so far, almost everything that I have seen, everything points in a very specific direction. Everybody is coming at it from very different source data and approach, but everything seems to be pointing towards, okay, Islam began in this manner. And when we spoke before, your data is something that is not really discussed by many people out there, and it really fits really well with absolutely everything, the context, and it was an eye-opener to see all of these sources that you actually have read and that you know of, and it gives a lot of context to what happened. So looking forward to, well, we've already started the conversation earlier, and you were talking about how things began even from way before Islam, which is very crucial to actually understand how we got to the 610s to the 650s, and then this religion really begins to take form in some way. So this really an eye-opener to see when you go back to before the time of Islam, before even the time of Muhammad, and saying, well, these things were actually there, because it really helps paint the picture. Islam didn't really begin because someone just said, here you have it, you have a nice book, and this is what we follow. So looking forward to see what things I can learn from you today, and I will do my best to ensure that we don't go to talk to the late Umayyads or the Abbasids, and we keep everything in that very important period of time when things are very, very messy, and we see how things really began to take form. So
right, yeah. So we started at we're going to write down a chronology together, and I think that said the first date that we should look at is in 523 is the correct date that I want to give you. 523 in the Himyarite kingdom, and this is like 100 years before Islam, and it's the first mention in Arabic of Muhammad as the messenger of God, as basically God's representation or represent. Maybe even manifestation, and it's in the Himyarite inscription, and it refers to the Jewish Messiah as basically as an angel, as an angelic manifestation of God. Now in Judaism, that is the spirit that is the spirit of God, which is mentioned in the book of Revelation. Sorry, in the book of Genesis, I should say, the first book of the Bible. Not the last book of the Christian Bible, the first book of the Bible, the book of Genesis, line 2, second verse of the first chapter, says the Spirit of God hovered over the waters. And in Judaism, the interpretation, what is the Spirit of God? This Spirit of God is the soul of the Messiah. That's what Judaism teaches. This is the soul of the Messiah. So this soul of the Messiah is referred to as Muhammad in these Himyarite inscriptions 100 years before Islam, the year 523. So that's the first thing we bear in mind. And that's a big challenge for the standard Islamic narrative, because you've got Muhammad as the messenger of God 100 years before Islam, and that's a serious issue. So that's where it starts, and then we jump forward into the 600s. Now, in the 600s, we'll take where did I go next after?
Well, next you actually went to 590s.
All right, the 590s. Okay, so in the 590s, we've got basically the persecution of what we have in it is we have to go to Persia. So we're looking at the reign of Khosrau II, and in there are differences of opinion exactly when this happens, but it's in the 590s. Khosrau II puts the Jewish exilarch, the Pharisee exilarch. The exilarch is the leader of the Jews who are the scribes and the Pharisees in Persia. His name is Hanini, and Khosrau II puts him to death. He executes him for supporting Bahram the sixth in opposition to him, and so he's not happy about Haniniah, so he puts Haniniah to death. And the next thing we know after that is about the same, I suppose, about the same time in the province of Orientalis, which is in South Iraq, between sort of Iraq and Syria. If you think of Iraq as sort of Mesopotamia, the Roman province of Mesopotamia, and Syria as the Roman province of Syria, then between Syria and Mesopotamia, you have this Roman province of Orientalis, which is very important. That's where it's all happening. Orientalis is a very important thing, and it's basically part of the Lakhmid kingdom. And in around 602, the last Lakhmid king, who's Nu'man the Third, betroths his daughters to makes an arranged marriage with the parents of Hani ibn Qabisa, so that his daughters marry Hani ibn Qabisa, or will marry Hani ibn Qabisa when Hani ibn Qabisa is grown up. So that's another important thing to be aware of. Nu'man III is the last of the Nasrid leaders of the Lakhmid kingdom. Nasrids are very important. They were probably some kind of adoptionists, which is usually called Nestorian or Nasra in the Islamic stories. Okay, then in 610 or 609, 610, this is an important time. In 609, 610, we have something called a deoccultation of Mars takes place, which is visible in Hira in South Iraq. And at this time, it's probably taken as a good omen, because Khosrau II sends his army to go and conquer the Holy Land in the 610s. And he has appointed somebody called Nehemiah ben Hushiel to be the leader of the Jews in his empire. There is no more exilarch in control. The exilarch has been abolished. The scribes and the Pharisees are no longer in favor with Khosrau. They do have a Gaon who is leading a school of religious studies, of Jewish studies in the Persian Empire, but there is no more exilarch in power at this time. Instead, Khosrau II has appointed this person, this Karaite or Sadducee type Karaite, who's called Nehemiah ben Hushiel, and he's controlling the army of Jews, which Khosrau sends in the 610s. He sends them to go and conquer the Holy Land. Am I being clear so far?
Yes, so with then Nehemiah ben Hushel is the one that basically is being sent ahead so that the Persians don't really lose their own people and they say, hey, you guys can go and, be the ones that take the first blow. You said that he was a Sadducee Karaite. Would you like to actually explain more about what that actually meant for them? What were his beliefs and the beliefs of his people?
So Karaites and Sadducees have something in common that they don't. By this time, now that the Talmud has been written down, the Karaites and Sadducees have something in common. Originally, Karaites and Sadducees were not exactly the same sect. Karaites were simply Pharisees who did not believe that the oral Torah should be written down. They were opposed to the scribes. They didn't agree with the scribes. They didn't want to have the oral Torah written down. They thought it was prohibited to write the oral Torah down. And the other Pharisees, who were on the side of the scribes, said, yeah, the scribes should be writing down what we say. And so the scribal faction of Pharisees became the Talmudists, and they have the Talmud written down. And the non-scribal Pharisees became the Karaites, who had no written oral Torah. That's in the 1st century. But by the 7th century, we're actually in the 7th century now. By the 7th century, this is hundreds of years later. This is 600 years later, and the oral Torah, which hasn't been written down by the Karaites, is now really suffering. So they almost have no oral Torah, and so it's very difficult to distinguish Karaites from Sadducees, who are a different sect of Jews who have no oral Torah. Okay,
one second. So the Karaites, they relied very much on oral tradition. I don't know if that actually rings a bell with any other, say, religion who actually relied very heavily on oral tradition.
Yeah, that's right. The Karaites did, and the word, in fact, the word Karai it's actually related to the word for the Quran as well, and the Qaris, the people who recited the Quran. So they were people of recitation. They believed to recite is better, and the Karaites were opposed to the idea of writing anything down. They didn't want to write anything down, as in oral Torah. So they had the written Torah, and that was it. They didn't write down the oral Torah. But as I said, after 600 years of this, following the destruction of Jerusalem and the conquest of the Holy Land by the Romans and the expulsion of the Jews from the Holy Land, the Karaites were suffering. Their oral tradition was really suffering. So they were not that easy to distinguish from Sadducees by this point. 600 years is an awfully long time, right? So it was not easy to distinguish them from Sadducees. So we can say that at this point in the 600s, the Sadducees, who have no oral Torah, who reject the idea of oral Torah, and the Karaites, who did not write down the oral Torah, even though they had some concept of oral Torah, it hadn't been written down, they were more closely aligned with each other by this time than either of them were to the Pharisees and the Talmudists, who had written it down. They were believing that they should write down and record the oral Torah and record their tradition. So they were an opposing faction to the scribes and the Pharisees. They were on the opposite side. Is that a good enough explanation?
Yeah. Do you think, this is actually going on a tangent, but do you think that the fact that they were struggling already, the Karaites, with their oral traditions, and then someone started to write things down, maybe, perhaps because they were already Sadducees, do you think that may have influenced the myth in Islam of people were memorizing the Quran, then they cannot memorize it anymore. People are dying in battle, and then suddenly they have to write it down very quickly because otherwise they would lose more and more verses. Do you think that?
Yeah. I think that this part. I think this part of the standard Islamic narrative is exactly taken from this. But the point at when they start writing things down is decades later, many decades later. Yeah. So at this point, it's as the standard Islamic narrative is saying about the Qaris, that they don't believe in writing it down. Everything has to be recited. It's the same as the Karaite position at this point. Yes.
Okay, good.
Okay, so now where do we go next? So there was, it's what the standard Islamic narrative refers to as the first hijrah, around 617, 618, something like that. And in this year, 618, is when Khosrau basically, I forgot to say, I should have said that Nehemiah ben Hushiel's army were sent by Khosrau to conquer the Holy Land, and they succeeded. In 614, Nehemiah ben Hushiel's Sadducee Karaite army actually succeeded in conquering the Holy Land for Khosrau II, evicting the Roman authorities, and the power was taken by Persia instead. So that's an important point in 614. And then another thing to mention is the very first attempts to organize the Oriental Orthodox Church, the very first synod, if you like, where the Oriental Orthodox Christians are starting to be emerging into or starting to organize themselves in a similar way to how the Romans do, is after this conquest. It happens after this conquest in the year 616. And the Copts and the Syriacs are having a discussion in 616. Then, in 617, 618, Khosrau turns against the Jews who have just conquered Jerusalem for him. and he evicts them. He throws them out. And this is corresponding to about the time of the first hijrah in the standard Islamic narrative, where it says in the standard Islamic narrative that the early Muslims had to run away from their city, and they had to go to Abyssinia, and they went to different places in Anatolia and Abyssinia and various places. They tried to survive, and that is actually, I think, related to this event that happens when Khosrau betrays the Israelites. Khosrau is a Persian, and the Persians are sort of associated biblically with the very first Persian ruler, who is regarded as a good man. The first good Persian ruler, the first holy Persian ruler, is Cyrus the Great, Cyrus. And I think that this word is used to refer to the Persians and has been remembered in the standard Islamic narrative as Quraysh. Okay, so Cyrus is a symbol of the Persians at this point. So the standard Islamic narrative says that Quraysh attacked the Muslims, and the Muslims had to run away to different places, and that's the first hijrah. But I think this is actually a corrupted memory of actually Persia, Quraysh, i.e. Khosrau specifically in this case, turning his back on Nehemiah ben Hushiel and his people, who have tried to establish a government on the Temple Mount. That government is called a Mamed. They tried to establish a Mamed on the Temple Mount and start to organize a Jewish government there. Khosrau is not happy about this because I think the Christians in the area complained to him, and the Jews have served their purpose. They've conquered the land for him, but now the majority of the population are Christian, and so he has to sort of appease them in some way to be able to maintain, make himself popular in their eyes, and to maintain control over the area. Otherwise, he's just going to have a revolution. He's going to spend his whole time putting down revolutions. So he, yeah.
Couple of questions about this. So we're actually now talking about the period between 614 and about 618, and say a moment later, and a moment, and then the Jews are going to be expelled from Jerusalem. Now, is that what happened at that point with Nehemiah ben Hushiel? Is he still going to be the leader in exile, or is he going to be assassinated as it almost every time happens?
Yeah, Nehemiah ben Hushiel was killed, but his Sadducee Karaite group fled to different areas, to the south and to the north to Edessa. Okay,
still on that period of time. So where he gets assassinated, and then everybody actually moves around. Mm-hmm. The government, or say the stuff that they were going to actually set up in Jerusalem, would have been something along the lines of Sadducee Judaism or Karaite. So it wouldn't be something that we would immediately recognize today as Judaism, but a very specific faction, right?
Yes, it's a very specific. They were zealots. They were militaristic. They were not pacifist. Rabbinical Judaism is pacifistic. People might find that difficult to believe because of the behavior of the state of Israel today, which claims to be Orthodox Judaic, but that's actually very anomalous. For the past 2,000 years, Rabbinical Judaism, scribes and Pharisees are pacifists, okay? But the Karaites and the Sadducees are not pacifists. They're militaristic. They are zealots. They have as I said, the Karaites have lost the oral Torah. They've very little to no oral Torah. It's basically the written Torah as it is written. That's their interpretation, what we call a sola scriptura interpretation of Judaism, taken from the scriptures alone, which is a very different religion from Pharisaical Judaism, just so you know. But nevertheless, they were the ones who were in charge.
Okay, and before we actually move on from that time stamp, is that you began by saying that the very first inscription found from the Himyarite kingdom, so that's down there in Yemen, 100 years prior. So the south of the peninsula would actually have been converted to Judaism. During these things that happened then, say 100 years later, when we are in the conquest of Jerusalem and so on, did the kingdoms of the south, do you think they have any impact? Did they send warriors to fight with the Persians, or were they at that point still like a completely different kingdom and they didn't get involved?
They were not involved. It
Okay.
was a completely different kingdom. They wouldn't even had the same religion of the Himyarite kingdom were uh, um, Pharisaical, Talmudist. That means scribes and Pharisees. They had the oral tradition. They had that was their position down there in Himyar. They had lots of Noahides as well. Noahides are the Gerim, the people who are non-Jews who are um, grafted into the Hebrew nation, and they had that in Himyar. There's a lot of conversion going on down there. So this is something that Sadducees and Karaites avoid. Karaites and Sadducees don't like to do conversions. So even today, it's very difficult to convert to Karaite Judaism. Sadducees don't believe in conversions at all. They were a different group. But certainly, as some of these would have, as I say, the standard Islamic narrative talks about the first hijrah at this time, and it has this story about some of the Muslims running down to Abyssinia to the south, and meeting the authorities, the imperial authorities of Abyssinia, and there is this sentence where the ruler says the difference between me and you is as thin as this line. So, and this line may be a reference to the oral Torah, for example. So it could be that they're saying, well, we recognize you as Hebrew, we recognize you as Jews, but you don't have the oral Torah. So there is a difference. There's a line in the sand between us, but that's the only difference between us.
Okay, so we are pretty much 5 minutes before the first, the second hijrah, but the big one, the one that everybody knows about. And at that point, these groups have not actually gone anywhere south of Israel, pretty much. It's been all about Syria, Armenia, Iraq, and Israel for the most part, right?
Yes, but some of the refugees who were running away from Israel probably did go to the south.